In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But before the eternal darkness consumed the galaxy, before the Imperium became a rotting corpse worshipping a corpse, there were moments of such profound tragedy that even the uncaring void itself seemed to weep. This is the story of the Thousand Sons. This is the story of a father who loved his children so deeply that he damned them all. This is the story of the day 10,000 warriors screamed as their flesh turned to dust, and sorcery became their only salvation. The planet was called Prospero, a jewel of enlightenment in an Imperium that had begun to fear knowledge itself. Towers of white stone and crimson glass pierced the sky like fingers reaching toward forbidden truths. Libraries that held the accumulated wisdom of 100 conquered worlds. Gardens where psychic energy bloomed like flowers, tended by scholars who believed that understanding the warp was humanity's birthright. It was beautiful. It was doomed. Magnus the Red stood atop the highest spire of Tisca, the city of light, and gazed across his kingdom. He was a Primarch, a demigod crafted by the Emperor of mankind himself, and among his brothers he was perhaps the most tragic. Where Horus possessed charisma and Leman possessed order, Magnus possessed something far more dangerous. He possessed curiosity. His single eye, for his father had taken the other in a bargain Magnus never spoke of, burned with psychic fire as it surveyed the realm he had built. A realm of scholars. A realm of seekers. A realm that the wider Imperium had begun to call heretical. The Thousand Sons were his children, his warriors, his students. Each one a potent psyker, each one trained in the disciplines Magnus himself had codified. They wore armor of deepest crimson and gold, marked with symbols of protection and enlightenment that Magnus had painstakingly researched. They were proud. They were powerful. And they were already dying. The flesh change had claimed them long before the fires came to Prospero. It was a curse woven into their very geneseed, a mutation that caused their bodies to erupt in uncontrolled transformation. Warriors would suddenly scream as their arms became tentacles, as their faces split into beaks and eyes multiplied across their flesh. Some transformed into mindless spawn, all traces of their humanity consumed by the warping of their flesh. Magnus had watched hundreds of his sons succumb. He had held them as they begged for death. He had promised them he would find a cure. He had lied. There was no cure. There was only delay. Only bargains made in desperation with entities that wore concern like a mask over infinite hunger. Magnus had delved deep into the warp, deeper than any save the Emperor himself, and he had made contact with beings of immense power who whispered that they could help. They called themselves teachers. They called themselves saviors. Magnus, in his pride and his love for his sons, believed he could take their knowledge without paying their price. Ahriman stood in the Chamber of Remembrance, surrounded by statues of those who had been lost to the flesh change. Each sculpture was carved from psychically reactive crystal that captured the final moments of the warrior's life. Some showed noble faces twisted in agony. Others showed things that had once been human but had become something else entirely. Ahriman was Magnus' most gifted student, chief librarian of the Thousand Sons, and the weight of every loss pressed upon his mind like a physical burden. His psychic hood hummed softly as it regulated the flow of energy through his consciousness. Without it, his power would consume him. With it, he could reshape reality itself, if only for moments. But he could not cure the curse. He touched one statue gently, a memorial to his own twin brother, Ormuzd, who had succumbed years ago. The crystal was cold beneath his gauntlet fingers, but his psychic senses could still feel the echo of his brother's final scream. Ahriman had sworn on that day that he would find a way to save his remaining brothers. He had studied forbidden texts. He had consulted with Magnus. He had pushed his mind to the very edges of sanity and beyond. And he had found nothing. Nothing but whispers from the warp that promised power in exchange for submission. The Thousand Sons numbered 10,000 strong, but how many would remain by the decade's end? How many would twist and mutate and become monsters that had to be destroyed by their own brothers? The question haunted every warrior of the Legion. They could feel the curse lurking in their blood like a sleeping serpent, waiting for the moment of weakness when it would strike. Some tried to suppress their psychic abilities entirely, hoping that reduced power might slow the mutation. But Magnus forbade this. He insisted that their psychic nature was their greatest strength, their defining characteristic, and to deny it was to deny their very purpose. So they trained. They meditated. They studied the intricate geometries of Enochian protection and the flowing scripts of Prosperine warding. They learned to channel the warp through elaborate rituals that distributed the psychic load across multiple minds, reducing the strain on any individual. They developed the rubric of Ahriman. No, that came later. That came after. Before the fall, they simply tried to survive, day by day, transformation by transformation, funeral by funeral. The Emperor had forbidden the study of sorcery. At the Council of Nicaea, held on a distant world where the Primarchs and their advisors had gathered, the future of psychic power in the Imperium had been decided. Leman Russ, the Wolf King, had argued that psykers were too dangerous, too prone to corruption. Mordorion, the Death Lord, had spoken of the horrors he had witnessed when psychic power ran unchecked. And the Emperor, their father, their creator, had agreed. The librarious programs across all legions were to be disbanded. Psychic power was to be suppressed, controlled, minimized. Magnus had argued passionately against the edict. He had explained that psychic power was simply another tool, another aspect of human evolution that must be understood and mastered, not feared and suppressed. He had warned that ignorance was more dangerous than knowledge, that those who refused to study the warp would fall prey to it far more easily than those who understood its nature. But his words had fallen on deaf ears, or perhaps on ears that heard too well and feared what they heard. The edict had been passed. Magnus had left Nicaea humiliated and angry. But he had not obeyed. How could he? His entire legion was psychic. To suppress their power was to condemn them to the flesh change. So he had returned to Prospero and continued his studies in secret, telling himself that he was acting in the best interests of his sons, that the Emperor would understand once Magnus proved the value of controlled psychic mastery. And then Horus fell. The news came to Magnus in a vision, as so much knowledge came to him. He had been deep in meditation within the Pyramid of Photep, his consciousness drifting through the currents of the warp, when he saw it. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, the Emperor's favored son, the most perfect of all the Primarchs, standing in a temple dedicated to powers that humanity was meant to reject. Magnus watched in horror as Horus made a choice that would doom the galaxy. He saw the tendrils of chaos wrap around his brother's soul. He saw the future unfold in terrible clarity. Brother would turn against brother, the Imperium would burn, and humanity would drown in an ocean of blood. Magnus had to warn the Emperor. Immediately. Desperately. But Terra was on the other side of the galaxy, and conventional communication would take too long. Even astropathic communication might be intercepted or delayed. There was only one way to ensure the message arrived in time. Magnus would have to project his consciousness directly to Terra, directly to the Imperial Palace, directly to the Emperor himself. It would require an immense working of power, something that would shatter every ward and protection Magnus had carefully constructed. It would violate the Edict of Nicaea in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. But what choice did he have? The Imperium itself was at stake. He gathered his most powerful sorcerers. He prepared rituals that drew upon knowledge he had sworn to keep hidden. He opened his mind to the warp in ways he had never dared before, channeling power that made his eye blaze like a star. The entire city of Tisca trembled as Magnus worked his spell. Reality itself seemed to bend and crack under the weight of his desperation. And he succeeded. His consciousness tore through the warp like a meteor, bypassing every defense, every ward, every protection that surrounded Terra. He manifested directly before the Emperor in the Imperial Palace, in the heart of the webway project that the Emperor had been constructing in absolute secrecy. Magnus told his father everything. He explained Horus's fall, the corruption that had taken hold, the civil war that was about to erupt. He expected gratitude. He expected immediate action. Instead, he received only silence. The Emperor stood before him, golden and terrible, and Magnus finally understood what he had done. The psychic shockwave from his sending had not simply bypassed the Emperor's defenses. It had shattered them. The Webway Project, the Emperor's grand design to free humanity from dependence on warp travel, had been catastrophically damaged. Demons were pouring through the breach Magnus had torn in reality. Thousands would die to contain the damage. Perhaps tens of thousands. And all of it was Magnus' fault. The Emperor spoke a single word. Judgment. And Magnus' consciousness was cast back to Prospero with such force that he collapsed, bleeding from his eye, his nose, his ears. When he finally regained awareness, he knew that he had failed. He had tried to save the Imperium and instead had doomed it further. He had tried to prove the value of controlled psychic power, and instead had proven its danger. He had tried to warn his father, and instead had become a cautionary tale. The Thousand Sons would pay for his arrogance. He knew this with absolute certainty. The Emperor would send someone to punish Prospero. The only question was who. The answer came with howls in the night. Leman Russ, the Wolf King, Primarch of the Space Wolves, had been given a task by the Emperor. Bring Magnus to Terra to answer for his crimes. Stand down the Thousand Sons. Secure Prospero. But Horus, already deep in his betrayal, had intercepted the orders. With honeyed words and false concern, Horus had convinced Russ that Magnus was beyond redemption, that the Thousand Sons had fallen to chaos, that only complete destruction would suffice. Russ, who had always distrusted Magnus, who had argued against him at Nicaea, who saw psychic power as inherently corrupting, believed the lie. The Space Wolves came to Prospero not as jailers but as executioners. The first strike came at dawn. Orbital bombardment turned entire districts of Tisca into lakes of molten glass. The carefully maintained libraries, the repositories of knowledge gathered across centuries, burned in fires that reached temperatures hot enough to vaporize stone. The psychic gardens where the Thousand Sons had learned to commune with the warp safely were reduced to ash and screaming emptiness. Thousands of civilians, the scholars and their families who had made Prospero their home, died before they even understood they were under attack. The Thousand Sons scrambled to respond, but they were utterly unprepared. Magnus had seen the attack coming in his visions. He had known the wolves were coming. But he had forbidden his sons from preparing any defense. This was his punishment, he insisted. He had broken the Emperor's edict. He had damaged the Webway. This was justice, and he would not compound his sins by resisting. Let the wolves come. Let them do what they must. The Thousand Sons would stand down and accept their fate. Ahriman could not believe what he was hearing. Stand down? Accept destruction? Watch as everything they had built was torn apart. No. He refused. If Magnus would not lead them, then Ahriman would. He gathered the captains of the Thousand Sons, and together they defied their Primarch's orders. They would defend Prospero. They would fight. Not because they believed they could win, but because to stand passive while their world burned was an insult to everything they represented. They were Space Marines. They were the Thousand Sons. And they would die as warriors, not as sacrificial lambs. The Space Wolves made planetfall in overwhelming numbers. They came in drop pods that hammered into the streets of Tisca like meteors. They came with land raiders and predator tanks, with terminators and grey hunters, with the full fury of a legion unleashed. And at their head came Leman Russ himself, the Wolf King, massive and terrible in his armor, wielding weapons that had drunk the blood of 100 worlds. His eyes burned with righteous fury. His wolves, massive creatures warped by Fenrisian evolution, bayed for blood. This was not war. This was extermination. The Thousand Sons met them in the rubble of their city. Crimson armor flashed in the smoke and fire as they erected psychic barriers, as they unleashed bolts of warp fire that reduced space wolves to screaming torches. Ahriman led from the front, his staff blazing with power, reality bending around him as he turned aside bolter shells with thought alone. His Sekhmet Terminators, the elite of the elite, teleported directly into enemy formations, their force weapons carving through armor and flesh with contemptuous ease. But for every space wolf that fell, 3 more took his place. The wolves fought with a savagery that transcended tactical doctrine. They were not simply warriors executing orders. They were executioners reveling in their purpose, hunters who had finally been unleashed upon prey they had always despised. The space wolves had never trusted the Thousand Sons. They had always seen psychic power as witchcraft, as corruption waiting to happen. Now they had permission to act on that hatred, and they did so with terrifying enthusiasm. The battle raged through streets that had once echoed with philosophical debate. Libraries became fortresses. Meditation halls became killing grounds. The Thousand Sons fought with desperate skill, using their psychic abilities to devastating effect. They collapsed buildings onto advancing wolf packs. They ignited the very air with flames drawn from the warp. They reached into the minds of their enemies, and showed them nightmares that left hardened space marines catatonic. But it was not enough. It could never be enough. The flesh change accelerated under the stress of battle. Warriors who had maintained control for decades suddenly felt their bodies betray them in the heat of combat. A tactical marine would be firing his bolter one moment, and the next his arm would erupt into a mass of tentacles. A devastator would steady his lost cannon, only to have his legs fused together into a serpentine tail. The mutations came without warning, without mercy, and those afflicted either died immediately or became mindless spawn that attacked friend and foe alike. The Thousand Sons found themselves fighting on three fronts, against the space wolves, against the flesh change, and against their own brothers who had succumbed. Ahriman watched it happen and felt something break inside him. This was the nightmare he had spent his entire existence trying to prevent. His brothers were transforming. His legion was dying not just from enemy bolters but from their own cursed genetics. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Every death was a failure. Every transformation was proof that all his research, all his study, all his desperate searching had been for nothing. The Thousand Sons were doomed. They had always been doomed. Magnus finally emerged from his tower. He had watched the battle unfold from his sanctum, had felt every death of every son through the psychic link that bound him to his legion. The pain had been exquisite, a punishment he felt he deserved. But now, seeing his sons being slaughtered, seeing them transform and die in agony, something in him snapped. This was not justice. This was genocide. The Emperor had sent the wolves not to arrest him but to annihilate everything he had built. Very well. If the Imperium wanted a monster, Magnus would show them what a Primarch unleashed could truly do. He grew. His body expanded until he towered over the battlefield like a god of ancient myth, his crimson skin burning with eldritch fire. His single eye blazed with the power of a collapsing star. Reality warped around him, the laws of physics bending and breaking under the weight of his will. He reached out with his mind and seized a space wolf battle barge in orbit, crushing it like a child's toy, sending thousands of warriors tumbling into the void. He gestured and an entire company of space wolves simply ceased to exist, their atoms scattered across dimensions they had no name for. Leman Russ saw his brother's transformation and roared his challenge. The two Primarchs met in combat that shook the foundations of Tisca itself. Magnus wielded sorcery that could unmake reality. Russ wielded weapons forged by the Emperor's own hand and a fury that burned hotter than any flame. They were brothers. They were enemies. They were demigods engaged in fratricide, and the universe itself wept at the sight. Magnus was winning. For all of Russ's strength, for all his weapons and fury, he could not match Magnus' psychic might. Magnus lifted his brother into the air with thought alone, prepared to crush him, to end this farce of justice once and for all. But then he hesitated. This was still his brother. This was still Leman, who had been difficult and crude but had never been cruel without cause. If Magnus killed him, there would be no path back. The breach with the Emperor would be complete and permanent. Could Magnus truly take that step? His hesitation was his undoing. Russ twisted in Magnus' psychic grip and hurled the Spear of Russ, a weapon given to him by the Emperor, a weapon designed to pierce the defenses of beings exactly like Magnus. The spear struck true, punching through Magnus' psychic shields as though they were paper, burying itself in his chest. Magnus screamed. Not from pain, though the pain was immense, but from the realization of what this meant. The Emperor had given Russ weapons specifically designed to kill Primarchs. His own father had prepared for this moment. Had always known this might be necessary. Magnus fell to one knee, the spear still embedded in his flesh, his power flickering. Russ advanced, ready to finish what he had started. And it was in that moment of absolute defeat that Magnus heard the voices. The same voices he had consulted in his research. The same entities he had bargained with to slow the flesh change. They whispered to him now, offering salvation. Offering power. Offering survival, not just for himself but for his sons. All he had to do was accept their bargain. All he had to do was turn his back on the Imperium that had betrayed him. The choice took less than a heartbeat. Magnus accepted. Power flooded into him, not the clean psychic energy he had trained himself to channel, but something darker, something that tasted of eternity and damnation. The spear was torn from his chest by invisible hands. His wounds closed, but not with flesh. With something that looked like flesh but was woven from the substance of the warp itself. His eye blazed with colors that had no place in reality. And when he stood, he was no longer simply Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns. He was Magnus the Red, Demon Primarch, servant of Tsench, the changer of ways.